Hi, my name's David Staples, also official W3 Geek, and today we're talking about the CompTIA Network Plus N10-009 and what you can expect from the exam. So if you're planning on taking that exam in the near future, be sure to stay tuned. That's coming right up. So this video is really just kind of a quick synopsis of what you can expect from the CompTIA Network Plus N10-009 exam. So some things have changed from the 008. So if you've already taken the 008 or you've been studying that content, there's not a lot of changes, but there are definitely some things that you'll want to be familiar with. So first off, let's talk about the structure of the exam. So this is the objectives document. You can get it directly from CompTIA's website. I've got a link to that particular page in the description for this video, so be sure to check out the links in the description here. Also, I've got a few other links that you might also find useful, including some practice questions that I've just published to Udemy as well. So let's go ahead and zoom in here a little bit and take a look at some of the basics for the exam. Now, this exam is going to give you 90 minutes to take a maximum of 90 questions. Now, that's also going to include some performance-based questions, which might actually have you doing things like a drag and drop, place things on a diagram or choose some things from a drop-down list. You might have to type some things at a command line. CompTIA has had a variety of different performance-based questions over the years. But thankfully, most of the questions are going to be multiple choice-based questions, where you're going to have to choose from A, B, C, and D. If there is a choose 2 or a choose 3, it will tell you how many you need to choose. It's not a select all that apply typically, thankfully. I've never been a big fan of those questions. But when it comes to the exam, it is definitely going to be geared towards those who have some networking experience. So if you're looking to just memorize some content and be able to go take the exam, you may find yourself not passing this exam, because it does want to make sure that you actually have perhaps some sort of hands-on with networking command lines and networking gear, some of the different concepts that we talk about in a CompTIA Network Plus class. Now, the exam is broken up into 5 domains. Now, each of these domains is going to be worth a certain percentage of that exam. So starting off with domain 1, this is going to be our networking concepts. This is 23% of the exam. Domain 2 is going to be network implementation, which is 20%. Domain 3 is going to be network operations, and that is 19% of your exam. Domain 4 is going to be network security. Obviously, security is important to networks as well, so that is going to be 14% of your exam. And the last one, domain number 5, is network troubleshooting, and that is worth 24% of your exam. Nearly a quarter of the exam focused on troubleshooting networks. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the concepts that you can expect to see in each of these domains. These domains are broken up into what we call subdomains. So starting off with domain 1, networking concepts. We start off looking at the OSI model. So make sure that you're familiar with the 7 layers of the OSI model, kind of how they work with each other, what different types of devices work in those individual layers here, and what the layer numbers and names are for each of these. And again, if we talk about these types of things in the CompTIA Network Plus classes that I teach, and I'll cover a lot of these types of things in those practice questions that I mentioned are in Udemy. Again, the link to those is in the description down below. By the way, while I'm thinking about it, if you would go ahead and like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed this type of content, to make sure that you stay tuned for these future videos and perhaps even get notified when new ones publish. But let's go ahead and keep on moving with domain 1.2 or subdomain 1.2. We're going to be comparing and contrasting networking appliances, applications, and functions, which is where we're going to be talking about things like how switches operate at layer 2 of that OSI model and routers operate at layer 3 and so on. We'll talk about our wireless access points and content delivery networks, which are super applicable in the cloud. In fact, we do talk about the cloud some in the N10-009 exam, because a lot of companies are deploying applications and services and microservices out to these different cloud service providers. So we'll talk about the cloud some here as well as we get into subdomain 1.3, talking about things like virtual private clouds, the different models such as software as a service and infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, talking about the different deployment models such as our public, private, and hybrid. We used to also more so talk about the community clouds as well. CompTIA has kind of moved away from that in the 009 version of the exam. But of course, we'll also talk about things like virtual private networks, those capabilities of being able to connect our end users and remote sites into a corporate office or corporate headquarters, we're also using those in the cloud as well. So virtual private networks, or VPNs, are going to be important for that Network Plus exam as well. Now, there's also a number of different services that operate on different logical ports, and so you need to make sure that you're at least familiar with the logical port numbers that we see here. Again, these are also available directly from CompTIA's website. If you just go to the link to that Network Plus page, that again is down in the description here, that will take you directly to that page where you can download this objectives document directly for yourself and be able to see the different port numbers that you need to memorize. Of course, you can also just come back to this video and look at these port numbers as well and kind of refresh your memory and test yourself. Also, I do have some kind of flashcards available at my website, w3geek.com, if you want to kind of go through these different port numbers and test yourself on those. So moving on into other things networking related here, we're going to be talking about other types of protocols such as ICMP that we don't really talk about port numbers with. We talk about how we break up our communications typically into a TCP or a UDP type communication. Some services might even use both. We also get into things like IPsec, certainly very handy for things like those VPN connections. We'll get into different traffic types. I've got another video where I go into detail about unicast, multicast, anycast, and broadcast, so be sure to check that one out as well. In subdomain 1.5, we get into the wireless and wired types of networking. So you need to make sure that you're familiar with the different connector types when we're talking about wired. Again, wires don't have to be copper either. They can also include our fiber optic cabling as well. So make sure that you're familiar with the various different types of connectors. But for wireless, again, we're going to cover all sorts of different types of communications with wireless from typically Wi-Fi, but we'll also include a little bit of satellite in there as well. Of course, Starlink is a thing. But make sure that you're familiar with the 802.11 standards there as well, in addition to our 802.3 that covers our wired standards. If you're not familiar with IEEE standards, now is probably a good time to start becoming familiar with them. In subdomain 1.6, we talk about the different types of network topologies, such as a mesh network. And then we can get into things like fully mesh versus partial mesh, these different hybrid networks. We'll talk about the star designs where perhaps we have a centralized device and all sorts of devices connect into that, which is commonly what we'll see in different office buildings. And perhaps even your home network is set up as a star, perhaps for the wired part of the network. Whereas your wireless might even be partial mesh or a mesh network with different wireless access points throughout the building, the house, whatever you happen to be in there. Moving on to subdomain 1.7, we get into the different types of IP address classes, which is our classes A through E for IPv4. But we also are going to get into IP version 6 in a later module as well. I know a lot of people take a look at these IPv4 topics and say, haven't we kind of moved on beyond IPv4? But no, there's a lot of networks that are still using IP version 4. So we need to make sure that we understand those different IP address classes, breaking those networks up into smaller networks or subnetworks, as we might call them. How do we actually define our ranges of IP addresses using CIDR notation or a subnet mask and kind of what that looks like, perhaps even in binary form. Make sure that you're familiar with private IP addresses. RFC 1918, for example, talks about the private IP address ranges that are reserved within that class A, B, and C address space. So make sure that you're familiar with those ranges. Just to give you a little bit of extra information here as a bonus for watching this video, that's going to be in our class A. Anything that starts with the number 10 is a private IP address in that class A space. For class B, it is 172.16 through 172.31 for that Class B private IP address space, and then Class C, anything that starts with 192.168 is a private IP address that is denoted by that RFC 1918 standard. Moving on, talking about automatic private IP addressing, make sure that you're familiar with a PIPA, however you'd like to pronounce that is fine, but make sure that you're familiar with what that is, as well as our loopback addresses, which is anything that starts with a 127. Make sure that you're also familiar with VLSM. That's our variable length subnet masking. So when we're breaking networks up into smaller networks that may not be the same size. So our last subdomain for domain 1.0, as you can see, there's a lot of subdomains for this one. The last subdomain here, we're going to get into software-defined networks, also adding in our IP version 6 capabilities. Again, there's a lot of networks that are still using IP version 4, but there's a lot that are using IP version 6. And so we're actually seeing a lot of kind of meshing together of these, where we might be operating in a dual stack methodology, where you're running both IP version 4 and 6 at the same time. So we'll talk about those kind of things in those CompTIA Network Plus classes. We also need to make sure that we're familiar with something called Infrastructure as Code, IAC. This is something I talk about a lot in my DevOps classes, DevOps engineering. I talk about it in my developing classes, where we're teaching about how to deploy applications and services and microservices out to the cloud. Obviously not something we're going to cover in the Network Plus class, but it is important because we can actually design our network using code. So if I write out a template file, such as a JSON file, that's JavaScript Object Notation, JSON, or perhaps YAML, that's YAML Ain't Markup Language, YAML, I can basically define what the network looks like, a virtual network, using code. And then anytime that I need a new network deployed that's another copy of kind of that structure, it will go out and create that infrastructure using that template. So that's what we call infrastructure as code. Again, those are the types of things that you need to make sure that you're familiar with for the CompTIA Network Plus exam, this new version. So let's go ahead and move on to Domain 2.0 here. So Domain 2.0, we're going to look at network implementation. This is going to be a shorter one from the number of subdomains that we cover. So 2.1 is going to be taking a look at some characteristics of routing technologies, looking at static routes versus dynamically learned routes, and the different routing protocols that we might use, such as our BGP or Border Gateway Protocol, our EIGRP, which is a Cisco-developed protocol. It's our Enhanced Interior Gateway Routing Protocol, as well as OSPF, which is our Open Shortest Path First. We get into talking about things like network address translation, port address translation, kind of how those work, so that you should even be able to identify kind of how the traffic looks and what is going on when you're looking at things like a packet capture. As far as those routes go, we need to make sure that we can identify when there's multiple different routes to a destination in a routing table, which one is going to be used. So we'll take a look at things like administrative distance and the metric there. We'll also take a look at prefix length, and that's going to apply as well to our IPv6 type stuff here. Getting into 2.2, given a scenario, configure switching technologies and features. Here we're going to take a look at, we said that we're going to break a network up into subnets. So part of that might be also defining a virtual local area network, or VLAN, and kind of how we configure those on different switches. We'll take a look at different types of VLANs, such as our native VLAN, our data VLANs, our voice VLANs, how 802.1q works with all those. 802.1q defines our VLAN tagging. Remember, we talked about knowing those IEEE standards, right? So IEEE standard 802.1q defines that VLAN tagging. We'll talk about what link aggregation is and the port aggregation protocol, as well as the link aggregation control protocol. We'll talk about things like speed and duplex mismatches, what duplex even is. No, we're not talking about a building where two people or two families might live in two halves of that same building. Totally different type of duplex here. So we'll talk about half duplex, full duplex, as well as perhaps even some simplex in there as well. We'll also get into things like maximum transmission units and what that means, as well as these jumbo frames. But not all frames are equal, and so we'll also be talking about things like runts and giants a bit as well. Moving on to subdomain 2.3, given a scenario, select and configure wireless devices and technologies. We'll take a look at how these different wireless networks work. It used to be that we used our IEEE standards to describe all of these. So it used to be the 802.11ac, 802.11n, 802.11a, b, g, and so on. So these days, we're more so focusing on that Wi-Fi 4, Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 7. So make sure that you know perhaps both the IEEE standard as well as the Wi-Fi number, whatever that is, and kind of how those relate currently, because we are kind of in that transitory phase still according to CompTIA exams. So some of them you might need to know the IEEE standard, some of them you might need to know the Wi-Fi 5, 6, and 7, and they might be used interchangeably even on the same exam. So make sure that you're familiar with things like Wi-Fi's encryption methods. Hopefully nobody out there is using WEP, but you should certainly be familiar with WPA2 and WPA3. Some of the new things that we see with WPA3, some of the benefits of why we want to use that over WPA2 these days. taking a look at different types of guest networks and even captive portals that you might see in like your local coffee shop or a hotel or somewhere like that, as well as the different frequencies that these things operate on, different types of antennas. Again, there's a lot of things that we'll cover in some of these different subdomains. I believe this is our last subdomain for domain 2, and this is going to be explain the important factors of physical installations, where we look at things like our backup power and making sure that we've got clean power going to these different devices, so what a power distribution unit is, taking a look at things like our IDFs and MDFs within a building, taking into consideration the environmental factors such as humidity. Electronic devices don't necessarily like a lot of humidity, but they also don't like super dry areas either. So we want to make sure that we've got kind of that right or the correct range of humidity as well. But let's go ahead and keep on moving here with domain 3.0. This is our network operations. So this is where we're going to start getting into things like processes and procedures, looking at our physical versus logical diagrams, what those are. You might even map these out according to the OSI model layers. So where you see network diagrams, layer 1, 2, and 3, that's what we're talking about here. Life cycle management is certainly important as well. We know that when we create an IT system, that it's probably not going to be around forever. Now, yes, there are some cases where I see, perhaps on social media, hey, we shut down a server that's been running for 25 years. Kind of a sad day today. We don't see a lot of those types of cases, right? Typically, we're seeing, a 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 year life cycle or so for different applications and servers and systems and networking gear and whatever. So we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what end of life and end of support can mean for our organization. And thus, that's also important on these exams as well. Make sure that you're familiar with perhaps having a patching program and perhaps a change management program. There's some things from the ITIL world, that's our Information Technology Infrastructure Library, that are certainly going to be important for our CompTIA Network Plus exam here. For subdomain 3.2, we get into kind of talking about monitoring technologies, using things like SNMP, making sure that we're using version 3 because it includes encryption, whereas our version 2 Community Edition, or V2C as it's known, isn't really going to be that great of a secure method of using SNMP. So make sure that you're using version 3. Again, this is not a full-out course. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can here to cover everything that we need to know for this. If there's certain things that I'm talking about here, though, make sure that you're going back and spending some time studying, and perhaps even come back and watch this again and make sure that you're really familiar with everything that you see here. As far as our log aggregation, we can also use things like syslog and SIEM systems, that's our security information and event management systems, to collect log files from a variety of different locations. Maybe kind of look at them together and see if we can find any patterns across those different log files. APIs, you should certainly need to make sure that you're familiar with what an API interface is, or an API gateway perhaps, where we can programmatically interface between different services, microservices, different systems and applications, have them all programmatically talk to each other. And then various different things that we might do on a day-to-day basis, such as maybe scheduling certain types of tasks, maybe such as network discovery, or perhaps going out there and looking to see, hey, do we see any new wireless networks that perhaps shouldn't be here right now? Looking at subdomain 3.3, disaster recovery, or DR, is certainly important across a variety of different CompTIA exams. So you should be familiar with the terms that you see here from our recovery point objective and recovery time objective, what those mean and how they can help us with defining certain types of day-to-day processes. Our disaster recovery sites, make sure that you're familiar with our cold site, warm site, hot site. I even talk about mobile sites when I'm talking about these types of concepts in the CompTIA Network Plus classes that I teach. As far as our high availability approaches, make sure that you're familiar with active-active and active-passive. You might also hear that called an active standby. And then the different methodologies of testing. How do we actually test these processes as well? In subdomain 3.4, we take a look at our IPv4 and IPv6 network services. Network time is certainly going to be a very important thing, especially when it comes to security, synchronizing that time all across these different systems. So we'll talk about our network time protocol as well as the precision time protocol and network time security. We'll talk about the various different DNS records. We'll talk about the DHCP process known as DORA, which is our Discover, Offer, Request, and Acknowledge. So make sure that you're familiar with DORA. We'll also get into things like defining reservations and scope and lease time and all sorts of different types of DHCP options and how we might even integrate that perhaps with a TFTP server as well. As far as our name resolution, though, DNS, besides knowing those record types, make sure that you're also familiar with things like DNSSEC and DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, because we do want to make sure that our DNS is also secure as well. Moving into subdomain 3.5, we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting network access and management methods. So we would look at our site-to-site VPNs versus client-to-site VPNs, as well as other methods of how we can manage and monitor the different systems that we're working with, perhaps across a variety of different network types. And so that's where we'll get into things like our jump box or jump host. You might also see a few other terms for those as well, such as bastion host. Make sure that you're familiar with what in-band is versus out-of-band when it comes to management concepts. Some courses will even get into things like lights-out management. And then, of course, the different methods of monitoring and managing those with SSH, which would be at a command line. Hopefully nobody's using Telnet anymore. Also getting into things like a graphical user interface with RDP, APIs, consoles, all sorts of different things that we look at in these CompTIA Network Plus classes. Moving on to our fourth domain, network security. We said that this was going to be 14% of your exam. There's a lot of stuff in, I believe it's 3 subdomains, but we'll find out here in just a moment for sure. But this is where we're going to be looking at just some basic security concepts. We don't go nearly as in-depth as we do in the CompTIA Security Plus class, or perhaps any of the follow-on classes that come after that, all the way through the CompTIA Security X, which has just come out. And I'll be creating some videos for that here in the very near future, I hope. As far as things that you need to know, though, we need to make sure that you're familiar with encryption in transit, basically data that's moving across a network versus data at rest. Perhaps, those various different storage drives, databases, and so on, as versus, data in use as well. We also will take a look at PKI, our public key infrastructure, using various different certificates, what certificate authorities are. We'll take a look at all sorts of different forms of authentication. You should make sure that you're also familiar with, I don't see it on the slide here, but there it is, CIA, our confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Make sure that you're familiar with all sorts of different types of regulations as well, such as perhaps HIPAA here in the United States. Basically has to do with health insurance and patient data that needs to stay private. We also have our PCI DSS standards, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which basically defines the different types of encryption and security that payment card processors and e-commerce sites and everyone else need to use when processing credit cards, such as a Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and so on, American Express. Don't want to leave them out. GDPR, we've got our General Data Protection Regulation. That is going to be for Europe, various different privacy standards there. And the list goes on. There's tons and tons and tons of regulations that you should be familiar with out in the real world. Here we try and kind of limit it to a pretty basic list. Subdomain 4.2, we're going to get into different types of attacks, such as social engineering. This is basically exploiting the human element, because typically the human element is our weakest link. So we'll talk about different types of social engineering and kind of what those look like. And I even use some videos in some of my classes that kind of help display, here's what that looks like in the real world and what kind of the repercussions can look like as well. We get into things like ARP spoofing and DNS poisoning, DNS spoofing. Some people say those are the same thing. Other people will break them down into the differences. As far as our rogue devices versus evil twins, we take a look at those. We used to use the term man-in-the-middle attacks. Now we're calling them our on-path attack here in the CompTIA Network Plus N10-009. So make sure that you're familiar with the term on-path attack. If you've been doing this stuff for a while and you know it as a man-in-the-middle or MITM. We also need to make sure that we're familiar with things like DDoS attacks and even just standard denial of service attacks, but kind of what those are, what those look like, perhaps ping floods. I've got a demonstration video here on YouTube as well, talking about what a ping flood is, how I can make that work, and kind of what that looks like on using some virtual machines. So if you want to see some examples there, certainly be sure to check out that video as well. Our last subdomain here for security is going to be 4.3. Given a scenario, apply network security features, defense techniques, and solutions. So we get into things like device hardening, network access control using 802.1x and port security, MAC filtering, using our access control lists, including network access control lists, perhaps that you might see on one of these cloud service providers, such as Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. Getting into our different zones, we used to use a term here called DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Now CompTIA is using the term screened subnet, so make sure that you're familiar with that term as well. That is one of the changes here that you should be familiar with. As far as our Domain 5.0 network troubleshooting, we said that this is going to be 24% of your exam. So this is a common section, the subdomain here that we see 5.1, that you'll see across a variety of different CompTIA exams because they want to make sure that you're familiar with kind of the process that you might use when troubleshooting a variety of different types of IT systems. So the first thing that you want to do, obviously, is identify that, hey, there is a problem. We start gathering some information. We'll establish a theory of probable cause, say, hey, I think this might be the problem. Question the obvious. We'll test that, see if that is actually the problem. If it's a more complicated problem, then we might actually need to establish some sort of plan of action. We might need to actually escalate this to perhaps another network engineer or a different department, to HQ, maybe to a branch department, to our internet service provider, maybe to a business partner. There's a variety of different places that we might have to escalate this to, or we might just go ahead and implement the solution ourselves. After we've gone ahead and fixed it, or it has been fixed by whoever we escalated it to, we need to make sure that everything is working correctly. Verify full system functionality. We don't want to call 30 minutes later saying, hey, it looks like you fixed that, but now we've got a problem with this, because maybe you broke something else when fixing this. So make sure that you verify full system functionality. And I know that this is the last step here, but documenting our findings really should be done pretty much throughout the process. And that way, if somebody calls back, an hour later, and they get somebody different in the IT department, we can look up and say, okay, well, what did this other person do? Number one, but number two, if other users have this same problem, we know how we fixed it for those other users, those other branch offices, those types of things as well. So moving into subdomain 5.2, given a scenario, troubleshoot common cabling and physical interface issues. So I mentioned that we're going to be talking about things like runts and giants. This is where we get into those, talking about our different frame sizes, the different maximum transmission rates, MTUs as we call them, with our jumbo frames, our runts, our giants, and so on. We'll talk about different types of cabling, such as categories 5, 6, 6A, 5E really as well, 7 and 8, and so on. Our multi-mode versus single-mode fibers. So make sure that you're familiar with as many of the terms that you see here as possible. Moving into 5.3, troubleshoot common issues with our different network services. So here we're going to be getting into something called our spanning tree protocol. And this is where we get into things like acronym reuse as well. I know that if you've been going through this and you saw perhaps STP up above with our shielded twisted pair, well, this is a different STP. This is our spanning tree protocol. There's also an RSTP as well, our rapid spanning tree protocol, which basically helps prevent our network loops here. So make sure that you're familiar with networking loops, how those get created, how we can prevent them, how to troubleshoot them, what it looks like when we have a networking loop, perhaps from a switching perspective or from a routing perspective. Then we also get into things like address pool exhaustion, incorrect default gateways or IP addresses, duplicate IP addresses, what that looks like, what the subnet masks look like for our different networks and subnetworks. But then getting into subdomain 5.4, troubleshoot common performance issues. So we talk about things like latency or delay, or packet loss and jitter, kind of how those affect different types of data. Sometimes it's okay to have a little bit of packet loss. Other times we don't really want packet loss because we're having to retransmit some of that data. And that's where we get into some of the differences between TCP and UDP that we looked at in one of those subdomains previously. Moving into our last subdomain here, I believe it's our last subdomain. We are going to take a look at using the appropriate tools or protocols to solve networking issues. And so this is where you need to make sure that you're familiar with some of the command line tools, such as our ping and our trace route, what the command line looks like on both a Windows as well as a Unix or Linux system. Also, I'll include Mac in there as well. Be familiar with some of the basic networking device commands. If you hop onto a Cisco router or switch or whatever, you might need to run some of these different types of commands, such as show MAC address table, show route, show interface, show config, and so on. Now, it's not necessarily just Cisco. Obviously, there is support for very similar commands on our Juniper Brocade, various other types of networking gear manufacturers as well. But again, make sure that you're familiar with the various different types of commands that you might see there, as well as the different types of protocols and communications that these devices might use to talk to each other, such as our LLDP versus CDP here as well. This is our link layer discovery protocol versus our Cisco discovery protocol. So that is a lot of information. And I know that you're probably looking at some of these things and going, well, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is, which means that you've certainly got some room for improvement, some room to study and learn some of the different concepts that you may not be familiar with. Again, make sure that you go through and look at each and every one of the concepts that we've talked about in this video, as well as some of the things that I didn't talk about that are here in this objectives document. Again, you can go through and pause the video as I'm going through these and look up all the different types of information yourself, or you can go down to CompTIA's website and download this objectives document yourself. There is one thing that I tend to point out to my classes that I don't know that a whole lot of other people point out, because a lot of people don't realize this is here, but you'll see me talk about this in my CompTIA videos here, where this little note here in the CompTIA objectives is something that you should pay very close attention to. So the lists of examples provided in bulleted format are not exhaustive lists. Other examples of technologies, processes, or tasks pertaining to each objective may also be included on the exam, although not listed or covered in this objectives document. Did you hear that? So when you're taking the exam, if you see things on your exam that aren't specifically and explicitly listed out in this objectives document, don't panic, because CompTIA is actually covering all sorts of different things in this objectives document, but they can't list absolutely every little thing. So some of the terms that they'll use inside of this objectives document are rather broad and vague terms, and they're going to expect that you're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper and learn the different concepts and other terms that are related to kind of that broader term that they included in the objectives document. So when you're going through those practice questions, such as the ones that I mentioned that I published to Udemy, and you see things in there that aren't covered explicitly in the objectives, just know that they are indeed actually relevant to things that you could actually see on the exam. So again, there's a lot of things that you might need to go back through and review. If you've got any questions, certainly feel free to leave questions in the comments here on this video. Again, be sure to check out those questions that I dropped onto Udemy as well. But certainly look forward to soon seeing you in a future video. If you're looking for training, certainly feel free to reach out. I do multiple different CompTIA Network Plus and Security Plus and other types of classes throughout the year, in addition to some of the different cloud classes that I teach and developing classes, such as different DevOps engineering classes. So be sure to click on that like button if you haven't already. Also click on that subscribe button. Doing either one of those helps me out with the YouTube algorithm, so I certainly appreciate it, so thank you. But again, in the meantime, if there's anything else that I can do for you, be sure to leave a comment, reach out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. You guys take care.